Hey everyone, and thanks for tuning into Presscast one more time. I'm your guy Farbs, and today I'm joined by Sourabh Gupta out of Washington DC. He's an international relations policy expert with a knack for US-China relations, but today he's joined us to talk about Afghanistan. So stay around. Welcome to the show, Mr. Gupta.
Thank you very much. Happy to be on the show.
Thank you for taking the time. I know you're a busy man, and we usually have to get to the serious stuff very quickly at the beginning. But when I read about you, when I saw your name, I just wanted to ask you a little bit about yourself because I have a thing for India, and I think you're an Indian, given your name, and then you have studied in Mumbai, and I love Indian culture. So let's start about you, and then give us a little bit of background, where you grew up, what you're doing now.
It's interesting you say that. Yes, I did grow up in Mumbai, which was at that time called Bombay, and I did my schooling out there, even my college out there before I came to the United States. An interesting factor is the part of Bombay I grew up in, South Bombay, is has a lot of Parsis, Zoroastrians, lots of them. In fact, the Parsi Gymkhana was literally at the end of the street on which I lived. So many of my best friends were
I have
Parsis,
traveled to
frankly.
Mumbai, or Bombay as we call it here. So it's a beautiful, huge, crowded, crazy city, like the rest of
It
India. I
is,
love it.
it is.
So I'm sorry, I just jumped in. Go on.
Yeah. And interesting factor is because in among Parsis the name Sourabh is reasonably common, and so I used to get confused for Sourabh and Saurabh
I
and
did my
so
study. I mean, because the first thing I realized was, wow, is it the same name? So I did a little bit of googling, and then, if I'm not mistaken, your name, the meaning of your name is fragrance, but Sohrab has a different
yes.
meaning. It means when your face is rosy, and then when you're happy, something like that. So they're different. But I did my research.
Exactly. No, really interesting. So that's it. I grew up in Bombay, and like I said, I had lots of Parsi friends. I used to play a lot of tennis with them. Grew up, went to school, and then it just after I did my college, I came to the United States for graduate education onwards. But of course, Bombay is close to my heart, and it's the city that Salman Rushdie has described in quite a lot of detail. And I can understand how he describes it simply because he's been away from the city, so that image of that city 20 years, 30 years back remains in his memory, and he can write that. So that city has passed away. It's not the same city it was, but those images are just the same. And it's fascinating in fact, because I was at a conference a couple of a year back, and in a track to meeting, and there's this gentleman who turned out he's a Jewish gentleman who turned out to be the State Department's legal advisor during Ronald Reagan's period. So at least 20, 25 years ago. And shocking, he grew up in the same block in which I grew up in Bombay 25 years ago. So it just talks a little bit about that cosmopolitanism that's there in South Bombay. It's dying, unfortunately, a little bit, but it's still a very vibrant, vivacious place.
There's this book that helped me fall in love even deeper with India. I was on this trip, and then we met. There are so many travelers in India, and then many of them fall in love and stay there for a long time. And then we met someone in it was on a bus ride, and then he gave me a book. The name was Shantram. Have you read this book?
No, I
The
haven't.
name is Shantram. It's
No,
yeah, it's an Australian dude
yeah.
who is an ex criminal who ends up in India. He's in Mumbai, he's in one of the slums, and then he's got this crazy story, and then how Indian culture, Indian lifestyle transforms him into a totally different man, from a criminal to an enlightened person. So you can tell that I'm very, very amazed by the Indian culture.
Let me just jump in here very briefly and say, a lot of Indian influences actually is from Iran, particularly northern Indian influences is from Iran. And for me, I have always understood, I have not had the fortune of being to Iran. It's a place I would love to come. But for me, it has always been, a cardinal point of my this thing as an international relations specialist is that in Iran, India, and Indonesia, it's just a kind of a continuum out there. And particularly with regard to India and Iran, these are civilizations kind of trapped in nation states, which gives a very different hue to who you are as a modern state. You're not just a modern state, you're more than that. Because, yes, there is a little more of Indian and Hindu culture beyond India's borders, and there is a little bit of Persian culture beyond Iran's borders, but we are essentially civilizations trapped in a nation state. We are, in so many ways, I think I can well imagine the commonalities which just strike you as soon as.
Ma'am, maybe you've answered my questions that I was about to ask you, because you coming from India, now in the United States, but you're an expert on on China US relations. So I was, meaning to ask you, how are these things related? And then I guess I kind of got my answer here, right?
Yeah, to an extent, and let me come on that point where I have a little more to say, and that being, I grew up all my life in Bombay but I was born in a small town, but it's a very special town called Shantiniketan. It's in the state of West Bengal. I am a Bengali, and in West Bengal, that is the town that Rabindranath Tagore made famous. Rabindranath Tagore was the first Asian to win a Nobel Peace Prize in Literature in the early 1900s. He was the man who made Shantiniketan famous. And the important part about Tagore was his view of Asia as one. And therefore, for me, it's not hard to see. I look at Asia, I don't look at it from the Indian perspective and the Chinese perspective and the Japanese perspective or the Iranian perspective. I look at it from an Asian perspective. That is my dominant perspective. And in that context, then I try to do the major relationships. And the most important ones, of course, are US China. And I'm happy to say, it's a little bit of that cosmopolitan breeding which happens in a place like, I'm sure, in places in Iran and Tehran and just like in Mumbai. And my wife happens to be Japanese. My son is obviously an American. He was born here. So here I am, an Indian with a Japanese wife, with an American son doing China relations. And I love it. And that's a little bit about Bombay, frankly speaking.
Very interesting. So after all this nice introductions, let's get to the sour, the bitter part of the talk that we're
Yeah.
here for, and that's Afghanistan. Um,
Yes.
I just wanted to say something because of all the things that you said right now about all of us being one one big nation like Asia. And then I was thinking the other day that how the United States misunderstood the Afghan culture, and a lot of the things that we are seeing right now is because, from what I understand, you are the expert. I'm not. I'm just someone, a random guy. But from what I understand is that Americans, they do not understand the different cultures whenever they go there to invade them for whatever reasons they go. So they always think everything through an American eye. Am I right?
You are, I think you're absolutely correct on that. And that's why that works in places like in Western Europe, where there is a lot of similarity in the Judeo-Christian and Western political culture. And remember also, the America has enormous power. So if it is willing to expend those resources, even sometimes if it does not understand local cultures, But if it can come in with, with a benevolent mindset and willing to plow a lot of resources in, it can still work. Let me give you an example of Japan. Basically, after in the Second World War, I mean, America essentially tore Japan down. But then America, importantly, it maintained the institution of the emperor. I mean, there were talk at that time like the emperor needs to abdicate. Even maybe should we be executing this man? And they realized that the emperor is such an enormous institution in Japan. You need to maintain that institution. But aside from that, they tore Japan down and rebuilt it from the bottom up. They were instrumental in probably one of the most important pieces of Japan's legislation development, which was actually a very socialist thing to do, which was land reform. It tore away titles from people because land reform created created inequalities in society, and it was this great equalizer on the basis of which then Japan was able to grow. So, I mean, America can be flexible, it can understand it. So, the point in Afghanistan is this is a very complex and difficult society. If America was ready to plow in the sort of resources it did in Japan, and you can compare on a per capita basis the amount of money that the West has put into, say, a place like Kosovo after the wars of the Balkan Wars, and the amount of money it put in Afghanistan, it's marginal, and most of it was military also. It was towards the military side, not the civilian side. How is it going to succeed? And if you don't have that commitment to succeed, then learn the local cultures, the local institutions, and try to work your way through that, because that's the way, then the alternative path to success. And the US did neither. And this is, as the point that you're making, the US comes in with a certain arrogance and a certain expectation that you can just plaster a certain a stereotypical model and that'll work, and that does not work.
So let's take a couple of steps back to a little
Yeah.
before the Taliban time, attacking and taking over, when the United States was planning to leave finally and then end this endless war, and then everybody was criticizing the United States for being there for that long, for 20 years. So, and then they left, and then that happened. Okay. Um, so who should we blame here for? The United States for leaving, or the United States for not leaving, or what's happening here?
Oh, I think it's pretty clear to me. I think the United States has a preponderance of blame on its shoulder. And the reason for this is, I am not critical of the United States going in. The United States actually went in because of 9/11, and that triggered the right to self defense provision, which is in the UN Charter. So it went in as per the UN Charter's provisions. So it went in on a legal basis. This is different from Iraq. This is different from Libya, those wars, or even Syria, where what the United States has done is contrary to international law. What US did going in was not contrary to international law, because international law provides for the right to self-defense, and that is the reason the US went in to knock off, because the Taliban had housed Al Qaeda and etc. on 9/11. But the problems happened fairly immediately in terms of, once it went in, the distraction of going to Iraq, because Afghanistan didn't have the oil, Afghanistan didn't have that strategic location to reshape the Middle East the way Iraq could have. That's the way Americans thought, and so so Afghanistan became the stepchild in a way for in terms of what the US was doing. And now coming to this period which you're talking about, it's easy to it's we see what has happened today, and we kind of we point to factors that led to that to immediate factors which have led to the situation. But I would submit that this is something which should have been tackled more than 10 years back. After bin Laden had been killed, the US knew at that point of time that it was not going to be able to win the war against the Taliban on the battlefield. And there are reasons for that, and we can go to that. But I'll get to the main point being out here. If you know you're not going to win, you need to find, and you have to in some way accommodate or work with the Taliban. These are people you may have revulsion to, but in international relations, which is dictated by the logic of power, also you need to find a way to accommodate yourself. And so, 10 years back, when the beginnings of a dialogue should have happened with the Taliban to create a political structure which would include Taliban and Afghan government people, folks, that was not done. And then, when that process finally got initiated from late 2019, 2018 onwards, it was too late because the Taliban had essentially known at that point of time that it's going to be either them or the US. The Afghan government is not a player in the larger political dimension, frankly. And so, from that point of time onwards, decisions which should have been taken a lot earlier but were not taken because nobody wants to deal with the Taliban per se and legitimize it, those came to haunt the US 10 years back. I mean, 10 years down the line. And one can make a case that yes, the Afghan government it really didn't have its act going. When Ghani won the presidential election in a country of 36 million, he won less than 1 million votes. So we're talking literally single digit popularity or at least single digit mandate. But the fact of the matter is, the US knew that such a day would arise. It was always postponing it and pushing it away. And now, when it has come, it has done it, I would say, submit in a slightly irresponsible way. It went ahead without trying to force a political accommodation. You need to bang heads, both the Taliban and the Afghan government. The Taliban basically said, we will deal with you Americans with regard to the military aspect, but on intra-Afghan political matters, you have no say. You have to leave. And the US basically 2 years back under Trump said, okay, maybe if they say like that, they pretended that they did not listen to that something good would work out between the Taliban and the Afghan government, but it did not, because there's too much division and too much of suffering and pain and death and revenge among those parties. And so at the end of the day, the US said, okay, you know what, I'll just put my hands up and go. And that's not the responsible thing to do. But the responsible decisions should have been taken 10 years earlier under Obama, Mr. Obama. And I would actually, frankly, give a little credit to Mr. Trump for all his crazy behavior, that he actually tried to get that ball rolling, even if it was belatedly.
I agree with you on that. I think despite all this crazy stuff that he did, there were instances that he did a lot of courageous stuff, but people used to him being crazy, totally ignored them. But let's play the game of what if. So, what if Trump was still in power? Would he take the same decision? It doesn't really matter, I know, but what would he do differently? Do you think?
Yeah, what I think he would have done differently, and what would have not created this situation, is that Trump had essentially signed onto a deadline of withdrawal, which was May 1st, 2021. So we are talking a withdrawal deadline which was earlier than what Mr. Biden has, which is August 31st. But Mr. Trump, even after signing the agreement, had been kind of talked out of withdrawing all troops from Afghanistan. And so there was a residual 2,500 troops, American troops, and of course the US contractors, etc., etc. And my sense is that if Mr. Trump had won, we would still have a very skeletal presence in Afghanistan, and that the Afghan government and that the US would still be providing a certain amount of air cover to Afghan soldiers. It's once that air cover went away, the Afghan soldiers knew they were toast. It's no point fighting. They were going to lose. And frankly, I would submit that it's better the way that things have happened than the Taliban coming to power with another 100,000 or another 20,000 people dead in Afghanistan in the war. We'll have to see. I mean, Afghanistan can still degenerate into a civil war. So that process, unfortunate process, can still happen. But what Mr. Trump would have done, or he would have reluctantly done, because he would have been talked out from what he would have ideally wanted to do, which is to withdraw everybody, would have a very small skeletal presence in Afghanistan. There would be air cover for America, for Afghan troops, and he would have had a very active shuttle diplomacy continuing, which was happening under Mr. Khalilzad as a special coordinator, which was happening and which has allowed for those contacts with the Taliban to happen. And again, the point out here is that it could give a little more breathing time to the Afghan government and the Taliban to try to find an accommodation, because they knew then that Trump would be there for at least 4 more years. And so for the Taliban, they could hold out for 4 more years because they've held out for this long anyway. But they might just think, if Mr. Trump is there and this is the emphasis that the US administration is coming with, maybe we might just be a little more accommodative to the Afghan government's negotiating demands in Qatar, which they were negotiating in Doha. And that may have altered matters a little bit. But again, I mean, we were staring this in the face. It's a slow motion train wreck which has been happening, and Trump, I would say, also might have just delayed that, because at the end of the day, it was really about banging heads on the intra-Afghan side, and maybe the Americans thought that they just don't have that leverage anymore with the Taliban to do that. But who knows? But we wouldn't have had these sort of horrendous scenes. And I think these scenes will hurt America for a long time. That the image of that cargo plane going down the tech runway with the people literally will be the same as the helicopter from the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. I mean, it's burnt into our consciousness. And unfortunately, that's it. I'll still come back to 10 years back. These things should have been begun to be tackled. I think by 2015 onwards, it was too late. And even if Mr. Trump had been there, it would be a kind of a slow motion disaster, but we might have come to this day anyway.
So, do you think honestly, Biden administration didn't expect this to happen? So, no one inside his circle had warned him about the possibility of the Taliban's resurgence?
That apparently is the case. I think there was talk within State Department, and they have their intelligence and research division within state, which typically is probably the wisest intelligence, provides the wisest political intelligence, and was also correct at the time of the Iraq War with regard to lack of weapons of mass, etc., etc. But anyway, that's a very small intelligence outfit. The main intelligence bodies did not capture this. They were under the impression that, oh, we've trained these guys, and so they will be able to hold off for a decent interval while America is gone, and then Afghanistan can be left to its own devices. But what they did not, I think, grasp is the understanding of will on the battlefield. That I frankly feel the Afghan soldiers were trained as well as anybody could have been. The one thing which was lacking in their training was to go into war to commit suicide. And nobody trains people to commit suicide in war. I mean, except in the World War II in Japan, it happened. No, I mean, you're not. Committing to die is not part of your training, and the Afghan soldiers knew once they did not have the support, willy-nilly they would lose, they would die. What is the purpose of putting up that fight? And as I said, a lot of bloodshed may in fact have been avoided. And so, but I don't think the Americans thought on these lines, and I think it's just that failure to grasp a little bit of in hard scrabble places how it at the end of the day it comes down to motivation and will, and as much as you can train and do fancy other things, I mean, all that is superfluous, it's secondary. And I don't think they expected that. And Mr. Biden himself had been, I think this is where he has failed a little bit. For the last 10 years, he has always been a kind of a counter-terror type. Like, we don't need a huge presence in Afghanistan. We just need to deal with the terrorism, international terror, which might emanate from Afghanistan. And he lost this debate during the Obama administration when he was the vice president. And so he was now determined to ensure that this is how it's going to be. And in a haste to kind of emphasize his position, he did things in a little too hasty a manner for which now it has come to bite him in the wrong way. And so that's how I think the game is played out.
So is there anything right now that Biden can do to kind of like at least a little bit heal the wound that is created right now in Afghanistan?
What he is trying to do, and he does have levers. He does have levers. In that agreement which the Trump administration had reached with the Afghans, with the Taliban, and there was a parallel agreement at the same time which it reached with the Afghan government, the Trump administration. In that agreement, there are provisions with regard to the removal of sanctions, economic sanctions, as well as sanctions on individual Taliban leaders. And the Taliban leaders want a certain degree of international legitimacy, and they want a certain pipeline of economic flows happening, economic development flows, because they know, I mean, the country is in a bad state. It has had enough civil war, and for them, rather than fight, if they can be more moderate in their approach, the international community still has a strong vested interest that the development gains that have been made in Afghanistan are not squandered, and the Taliban understand that. And so there are levers that Mr. Biden has, and as I said, he has a very good line of communication right to the top of the Taliban. We know Mr. The CIA chief was there in Kabul meeting
William Burns.
exactly meeting Mr. Baradar, who's going to be essentially the political head. And frankly, Mr. Baradar was due to be in Camp David 2 Septembers back. Mr. Trump was trying to get this is the credit. This is a credit that Mr. Trump is due, regardless of his awful reputation, because at Camp David 2 Septembers back, he was going to have Mr. Baradar and Mr. Ghani out there and try to bang heads and see if something could be worked out. So that effort was being made, but everything fell apart at that time because it was so close to September 11th, and there was, I think, an American soldier got killed, and that became an excuse just to get out of this. But the U.S. has very good lines of communication to the top of the Taliban, to the political chiefs in the Taliban, not to the military side, presumably. It has levers over them. Of course, we've been hearing about how the Federal Reserve is holding some of Taliban of Afghanistan's central bank funds. So there are levers out here. So the point of what is to, unlike in 1990, when once the Soviets had withdrawn from Afghanistan and the U.S. just left Afghanistan to its own devices, I think it's useful for U.S. to stay engaged within a larger political structure of external parties who are both providing incentives as well as sticks with regard to Afghanistan. And I think the Taliban would be a lot more amenable this time, because they realized the last time around, if you host international actors, your bottom line goal is squandered, which is to be maintain incumbency over the Afghan nation.
Wonderful, wonderful. I want to ask you a question on a totally different topic. How's the coronavirus situation there where you are? Where is it? Washington? Where are you right now? Washington?
I'm in Washington, D.C. I'm speaking from my office in downtown Washington, D.C., and I live in suburban Maryland, just beyond Bethesda. And the greater Washington area has handled it well, frankly. The county where I live in, Montgomery County, is, I think, number one or number two in the nation in terms of vaccines, immunizations, of vaccinations. So out here they have made an attempt, but unfortunately, it doesn't matter if certain pockets of the country are well vaccinated. It depends on how the larger country does. I think there's been a dereliction of duty on the part of many citizens out here to be able to deal with the coronavirus. It's not in a good state. Delta is rising. It's shooting up, and the main problem, I think, this is, it's actually linked to, talking of Afghanistan. We were talking how the U.S. has this kind of standard operating procedures and stereotypical models, but it'll impose and it'll work because it works. It has worked in their country, and on a similar way in this country out here, there is this idea that, oh, science and scientific means like this vaccination. Once we have a vaccine, we're fine, we're good to go, and that we don't need to have any behavioral changes the way we and so what we have is vaccines which work but are losing the efficacy, which is allowing a virus to again float around, a virus to again create variants, but people are not willing to change their behavior. Again, we'll find another scientific dose which we will inject into our arms, and all will be fine. And I think as it's such an advanced country, and yet in certain ways, I mean, you just see where that level of advancement. Why can't I'm not even getting into the issue of freedom and masks and all those things. I'm just getting into the business of science and human behavior, and why can you not have a better, a more, uh, a better confluence of the two? It's just sad, but that's how it is out here, frankly, and unfortunately.
Mr. Gupta, that was wonderful. Very, very pleasant to listen to your comments. This is the time that I would ask you to end the show for us and say your ending comments. Anything that I missed asking you, anything you would love to share with us.
Let me just say one last point about Afghanistan, what makes it a very hard country, and it's important, which doesn't get picked up much or at all. And this is that point. Within Afghanistan, there is no one community, ethnic community, which has a majority. The Pashtuns have a plurality. This itself makes it a very fractious mix. When you have a real dominant community and you have a minority majority relations sometimes or many times are not good, but they find an equation. But when you have someone which is 40% and then you have 15%, 20% other communities, it makes for a very fractious mix. But what worsens that is that every ethnic community in Afghanistan has a greater number in terms of population numbers of co-brethren beyond Afghan borders. So the Uzbeks in Afghanistan have more Uzbeks in Uzbekistan. The Tajiks in Afghanistan have more Tajiks in Afghanistan. The Pashtuns in Pakistan, in Afghanistan have more Pashtuns across the border in this thing. And of course, the case of the Shia Hazaras and Iran. And what this does is that when any one community tries to dominate the other and is in a position to dominate the other can always just evacuate, move out beyond Afghanistan, nurture, nourish, and sustain itself, and be ready to fight another day. And that's why you have this kind of really fractured country, and why civil war in that sort of country is incredibly hard to resolve, because they won't fight each other at the end of the day. They will just retreat to fight another day when they feel they are in a stronger position. And all these factors need to be accounted for. And where's the Americans thinking about these things even when they went in and fought tried to do? But hopefully, the country has suffered so much over 40 years, and I'm hoping that at least if the Taliban can provide stability, moderation, tolerance, that the international community will still find an interest to stay committed to the development related aspects of Afghanistan, and that its poorest people and its weakest people will be able to survive and have look forward to a better future.